Okay, but I cannot see the other. Leilani, you have to give us the access to the video.
Yes, I think you can start directly. I have started recording.
Yeah, but we need the video working. And at least in my case, it's not working.
It is not working in
case,
my case either.
Yeah, we can see you.
Yeah, but I can't see anybody.
Neither do I. And if I make click on my video, it says that I cannot start video because the host has stopped it. Can you arrange that, Leilani?
Yeah, I'm trying to fix it. I think you can just start and I will try to fix this problem.
Yeah, but we need, for instance, Simon with the video to the video to start with. Simon, do you have access to the video?
No, but I think what you need is whether you can see my screen. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, yes, right.
Your screen, that's the first thing I've seen, Simon. Well done.
Okay, well, I can begin whenever you like, but I'll wait for you guys to give the introduction.
Okay, now let's start. We are already a little bit late. So welcome to everybody. Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. This is, as you know, an exercise dealing with the TPR of Nigeria. It's a preview of the TPR. And we are in the Friends of Multilateralism Group, meaning there's a group that we care about trade, we are interested in the subject, and therefore we try to deal with the future events like the Nigeria. Nigeria, as you know, is one of the biggest economy in Africa, so it's worth to explore and to understand what's going on there. I'm here on behalf of Mia, which is the chair of the FMG, but she's in China right now and she couldn't attend, so she asked me to make this small introduction. And with this, please, well, you know, the participant, Clemens Boonekamp, will be the moderator of the session, plus Simon Evenett and, well, Trudi Hartzenberg. And if he appears, Fred Agah, which is would have been very important for this meeting because he is the one who has been dealing with the TPR of Nigeria. With this, Clemens, everything is on your hands.
Thank you very much, Mario. And I allow me to apologize because things don't appear to be running as smoothly as they might have been. I'm now told that I can start my video, so let's see what happens. Yeah, I can see, I can now see myself and I can see Simon.
Yeah.
Please forget.
Me too.
Okay, I can't see you. Welcome all to this trade policy preview. I can see Trudi. How's it, Trudi? I welcome all to this trade policy preview of Nigeria. And in particular, I should like also, on behalf of FMG, and as a board member of FMG, to welcome our new members. I'm not sure we've done that yet. Our new FMG members, Willie Alfaro, Ignacio Bracero, Ujal Bhatia, Jesse Cryer, and Andre Sapir. If you're on board, I can't see who's participating at the moment. If you're there, welcome to you all. And welcome also to this trade policy preview of Nigeria. We do these previews of countries shortly before they have their trade policy review in the WTO itself. And we hope that with these previews, we might be able to excite discussion, perhaps by giving a slightly different view of what might be in the papers. We don't have the papers. We have a new look, an original look at the situation. And in this, we are invariably helped by some very, very good panelists. And we have some superb panelists today. We have Simon Evenett, the founder and the man in charge, person in charge of the Global Trade Alert, the alert which has become almost the reference for people wanting to find out about trade measures taken by countries. We also hope to have with us Yonov Fred Agah. Fred was a former Nigerian ambassador to the WTO. He subsequently was Deputy Director General at the WTO and is now the Chief Trade Negotiator for Nigeria. His contribution here, I think, would be invaluable, and I do hope he's going to be able to join us. And then we have the inimitable Trudi. Trudi is from the Trade Law Center, Stellenbosch in South Africa. She has the voice of policymakers, particularly in Africa. And her outfit has also just she's the executive director. Her outfit has recently put out a paper on Nigeria and Nigeria in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So she too is able to guide us on Nigerian trade policy in a rather expert fashion. We're going to start off with you, Simon, if you would, and guide us through your presentation on Nigeria against using your vast database on the global trade law and your expertise. Thank you, Simon. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Clem, and it's a great pleasure to be back with the FMG colleagues and those joining from the delegations in Geneva and elsewhere. Normally with a trade policy review, the focus is on the policy development since the last TPR, which in this case was 2017. There's a bit of a retrospective in order to assess what a country's government has done. Given that Nigeria has had a important change of government in May of last year, and there appears to be a very strong commitment to reform the Nigerian economy, which the IMF has acknowledged in their latest Article 4 consultation report, then I think the purpose of this presentation is slightly different. Yes, we will look backwards as we traditionally do, but I will also try and highlight the points of continuity and of change, and I will end the presentation with some questions which might help inform a discussion about where Nigeria's trade policy could go in the future. So that's my intention in this brief presentation. The last TPR took place in June of 2017. The chair concluded with a number of observations. There was a general acceptance and appreciation by the members that diversification of the Nigerian economy was a valuable, worthwhile objective, and that regulatory reform was likewise. This positive feedback was then matched with some criticism about lack of notification on TBT and SPS measures, concerns about non-compatibility of certain WTO measures, in particular relating to localization and the use of foreign exchange restrictions limiting imports, and also concerns about agricultural price support measures. As we will see, some of those concerns persist, and some have been cleared up since June 2017. First, I'll give you some development context and help situate this discussion. Nigeria is one of these large emerging markets which has had relatively strong economic growth, big falls in unemployment, but stagnant per capita income. And she's not alone in this situation. We've seen this in other countries we've reviewed in this group, and Nigeria has seen essentially growth without per capita income rises, but still significant employment effects. On the trade side, this economic growth at the national level, but wage stagnation has also occurred at a time of significant growth of imports and exports of goods, and the opposite as far as services is concerned. And I think it'll be an interesting question to ask why the service sector is floundering in Nigeria, while the traded goods sector appears to be doing quite well. Having laid out this development context and the trade context, let's turn now to the tariff regime. The tariff regime is pretty unusual. Only the headline statistic is the one in the final row of this table. Only 19.7% of the tariff lines in the Nigerian schedule are bound. The rest are unbound. And the ones which are bound, the bound rates are enormous, even though the applied rates are much, much smaller. So we have a case of a country which has very limited tariff bindings, and where the bindings do occur, huge amounts of water in the tariff. And this is one question we may want to ask later is, what is the development value of having an essentially unbound tariff regime, and to what use this has been deployed? Turning to the data which I have assembled with my team in the Global Trade Alert database, we do see an uptick of policy interventions which have been documented, almost doubling since the last TPR. What is perhaps the most interesting thing about this table, however, is the limited number of foreign measures which affect Nigeria. And this is, I think, a function of the small number of HS codes that it actually exports, relatively small number. For a country of this size, and let's not forget this is an economy, depending on how you measure it, between $300 billion, $500 billion, the difference depends on the currency and the year you look at prices. For an economy this size, one would expect their economy to be hit or benefited 2 or 3 times the number we have here. So this is an economy which is relatively unscathed, and that may be largely because it doesn't export too many product lines in the first place, or it may be that they just export things that people want. But still, they have an unusual pattern of trade policy engagement with the rest of the world. In terms of the policies that Nigeria has themselves, which are in force at the moment, the number of reforms, there is about a quarter of the number of trade distorting measures. The reforms on the right, are largely border measures, classic tariff cuts, import licenses, and quota reforms. But when it comes to the trade distortions, there are indeed some tariff measures. There are important currency measures, some of which have been unwound. But there are also a large number of subsidies which have been awarded to different bodies. Some of these subsidies are sector-wide, some of them are purpose-wide, for example, promoting exporters, and some are firm-specific. And so we have a country here which has a pretty mixed set of interventions, and certainly not confined to border measures. In terms of the sectors which have benefited from favoritism, these include commodity sectors, food sectors, and manufacturing sectors. And the history of Nigeria's trade policy is one of recurrent, often food crises and food policy interventions. So food security is a big deal here. And this is a country which has tried to actively develop industries through industrial policy. And we can see here that the favoritism is concentrated in a relatively small number of sectors. Now, turning from the incidence of trade policy, both in terms of sectors and the form in terms of policy instrument, we now turn to the estimates of how much imports are covered by different types of trade distortions that will be in effect at the time of the TPR. And you can see that the countries facing the most risk to their exports are listed here, and they're mainly the industrialized countries. The EU and the US stand out as the most targeted, but so does Latin America. So I'm not suggesting here that Nigeria is taking specific action against certain trading partners. It's more that the MFN actions that they have taken, or the subsidies that they've awarded, have tended to be in sectors where the US, the EU, and Latin America are particularly active. Quite interesting here is that the African Union countries are barely exposed to Nigeria's unilateral measures. By the way, I should add that everything I'm showing you here are Nigeria's unilateral measures. And you can see that about 15% of the African Union exports to Nigeria face some type of trade distortion. So there's a very uneven mix in terms of uneven exposure to Nigeria's harmful policy interventions. This carries over also on the liberalizing side, where it turns out also the very jurisdictions which face a lot of trade distortions in Nigeria also face quite a lot of trade reforms. And so there seems to be almost a match between the two. Maybe this reflects the fact that in the past there's been liberalizations and trade distortions in the same sectors, and this is what's being picked up here. But overall, if you compare the last slide, where the levels of exports at risk can run to 70 to 80%, with the levels shown in this chart here, which go from at the most from 50 to 60, 70%, you can see on net much more imports, bilateral imports, have been affected by trade distortions than trade reforms. Nevertheless, there are trade reforms, and we should acknowledge that. When it comes to which countries are particularly affected by or potentially affected by Nigerian measures, this chart here shows you the list of countries where more than $400 million of their exports are exposed to Nigerian measures. And you can see we have quite a number of European nations. We have Brazil, Russia, and the United States. And so we have possibly 7 countries which might have a relatively strong interest in asking Nigeria about some of its outstanding trade distortions. In terms of Nigeria's own interests and stake in the trading system, what we can see on this particular slide here is in which foreign trading partners is Nigeria's exports being made more difficult on account of unilateral policy intervention. And again, here there's the mix is largely the BRICS plus Indonesia, some European nations, and the United States. But essentially, we have here 9 jurisdictions which have put in place measures which affect more than, or at least expose more than $1 billion of Nigerian exports to different types of trade distortions. And of course, India and the United States stand out here as the 2 trading partners which put in place the most hurdles. So Nigeria has a strong interest, I think, in trying to engage in the trading system to try and help reduce these hurdles to their exports. Let me just make a few more comments before wrapping up. In terms of digging deeper into the types of measures that Nigeria has put in place in the past, I think one should differentiate between 3 types of measures. The first type are measures which support the sourcing of local content and the localization of production in Nigeria. And these measures are supported by various funds. I listed here 2 measures which have expanded the funds available for localization. And from what I can see, it seems that this aspect of the policy is continuing under the new administration. The second type of policies that we see are other forms of subsidies to support either domestic production or exporting, and these seems to have continued as well. The third type of measure, which is listed, the last 2 bullet points on this list, relate to foreign exchange restrictions, and the Central Bank of Nigeria had quite restrictive measures on allowing foreign exchange to be used for imports. And so there was, for a long period of time, restrictions essentially on importation through the foreign exchange regime. Now, the latest Article 4 report of the IMF confirms that these measures have been lifted. So this part of the restrictive regime appears to have gone away when one takes the most up-to-date information. Well, having laid out all these different policy developments and the development context, it seems to me that there are possibly 6 questions one could ask of the Nigerian colleagues, or at least to stimulate a debate about the relationship between trade and development policy. The first is, to what extent has the prior strategy of reducing dependency on oil revenues succeeded, and what role has the trade regime played in advancing that or retarding that objective? The second is, we've seen that Nigeria is unusual in having such a low level of tariff bindings. And one has to ask the question, what is the development payoff from binding so few import tariffs? Indeed, if you were to ask the question, what is the value of import tariff bindings, then one shouldn't find any of those benefits in Nigeria because they have so few bindings in place. The third is that given that Nigeria has been quite persistent in pursuing local content measures, one might want to ask what has been the payoff or the consequences of adopting those measures. Do we see any major success stories? And if not, why not? The fourth question to ask would be whether or not the central bank has given up for good on its resort to foreign exchange restrictions, or is this going to be a measure which will be pulled out of the toolbox the next time there's a current account or balance of payments problems. The fifth point to make here, and this came out in the IMF report too, is that Nigeria has food security concerns and worries, and in the past has often used trade measures to try and address those, but now has moved towards a regime of more extensive cash transfers, perhaps not too differently from those used in Brazil and elsewhere. And so the question is whether or not this evolution in the food security policy is one that will stick and is more trade friendly and potentially also more efficient. And then the last question, which I suppose draws together the following five, is given this track record and this strong desire on the part of the new government to reform the Nigerian economy, what are the lessons that we can draw for Nigeria from this experience? And of course, drawing from other countries' experiences too. And here, I'm looking forward to hearing what the other colleagues have to say, since they have a far greater experience from the African continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. One thing struck me: the countries affected by Nigeria's measures, China does not appear among them. I wonder what the reason for that was. And the Netherlands appears to be by far the largest, with well over. I don't understand why that is the way it is. And perhaps you can give us some insight into that later on. It also struck me that if they are, yes, indeed, they're worried about food security. Why is it, if they're worried about food security, that their SPS notifications are so few and far between? SPS plays a very important part in that. And I wonder if that point will again come up in the trade policy review. Fred, are you with us? Leilani, has Fred responded at all?
No, I haven't received his response.
Okay, I have received nothing. I've received nothing from him on WhatsApp either, but his name still shows up on the screen.
Lem,
Yeah.
Fred has chatted in the chat room with me, and he can certainly hear us. So I think it's a matter of him being able to activate his microphone. So hopefully that will work.
He's still in the chat room with you at the moment.
Can you hear me?
Oh, Fred, you're
There
with us.
he is.
I've been with you.
It's great to hear your voice. And I'm going to, this is Ambassador Fred Agah from Nigeria, Chief Trade Negotiator for Nigeria, former Deputy Director General of the WTO, and now with us to present us his views on Nigeria's trade policies and measures. Fred, after Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clem, and hi to everyone.
Can we see you?
You can see me?
I can't see you. Leilani?
Yeah,
Really?
we can't see him.
You see him? Ah, now I can see you, Fred. Yeah. Yes, now I can. You're in my top left-hand corner. Yes, I can. And I hope the others can as well. Thank you, Fred. Please go ahead.
So I want to thank Simon for his very elucidating presentation. I'm happy to participate in this webinar. I think to understand where Nigeria is almost like a long story. You may need to go back to the very first review in 1991. And some of the recurrent themes that Simon referred to remain with us. And largely as a result of the dominance of oil in the dominant role of oil in the national economy. Almost 95% of forex earnings and 85% of government revenues. So what I would try to highlight briefly are some of the trade policy objectives of government under the new trade policy framework that has been developed. And as you can guess, one of the priorities is to diversify the export base and reduce dependence on oil. develop a flourishing domestic market, enhance job creation and reduce high level of unemployment, enhance market access and create opportunities for made in Nigerian products in West Africa, Africa, and international markets, enhance competitiveness, as well as promote the facilitation, timely, cost-effective flow of goods and services. The trade policy objectives are anchored around some core broad principles. First, the development of the domestic market, promoting export diversification, industrialization, enhancing market access, which is one of the reasons why the office I now head, the Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiations, was created. And we also have in place a framework for the promotion of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. The policy trust in all this is at the normal levels of multilateral trade agreements. So Nigeria is an active participant in the WTO. It has given the organization a lot of its talent, including the current Director General. We remain committed to pursuing the objectives of the Doha Development Agenda and looking forward to the attainment of a fair, equitable, and transparent trading system that provides win-win outcomes for all countries. We are active in the AFCFTA process and the ECOWAS trade liberalization program, having put in place a common external tariff in the region. We are also active with the AGOA program as a bilateral arrangement. We seek to benefit from the GSP and GSP Plus programs of many developed countries. We are currently negotiating a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the U.A.E. Nigeria is also very active in some preferential trade arrangements like the D8 group of developing 8 countries, the UNCTAD GSTP scheme, as well as the trade promotion system of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So, since 1991, the main features of the trade policy regime remain the dependence on oil for forex and government revenue. I think this came out from Simon's presentation. In that regard, you would observe that the different episodes of trade policy are built around the cyclical fluctuations in the global oil prices. So when there is a boom, you see a lot of relaxed liberalization of the trade regime. As soon as there is a bust and fall in oil prices and government revenues, you immediately see a reaction of import or trade restrictive measures. And you can, if you look through our records in the WTO, even as far back as the GATT, one of the first measures we took was in 1982 under the Economic Stabilization Act, where we invoked our rights under the provisions of the balance of Article 18B or so, balance of payment restrictions. Somehow, there has been a tendency to prefer quantitative and administrative measures as opposed to price-based interventions. And these are the conditions under which some of the issues of food security and all that coming. It has not been easy to get to the point where there's an acceptance that price-based measures like tariff rate quotas, which take into account the level of domestic production, the level of demand, and the level of imports that may be needed. These are not yet part of the policy tools. There's also been, based on the challenges we have, a tendency for most MDAs and regulators, MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies, to work in silos. So trade policy coordination and coherence has not been very fashionable. And to also further distort the trade regime, a lot of the measures seem to be a direct carryover from the SAP measures that were adopted through the World Bank, IMF, structural adjustment programs in 1986. From 86 to now, we are talking of almost close to 40 years, but somehow those measures have remained the cornerstone of economic policy across many sectors. And the deregulation has further created distortions in the productive sectors of the economy. Overall, when you take a combination of the policy framework and direction, you will see clearly that there is an anti-export bias, so that what you get at the end of the day, you cannot easily determine the effective rate of protection. Domestic prices in Nigeria are very often higher than the average global prices for most commodities, in which case the incentive to export is diminished. And the subsidies, I won't even say subsidies per se. These are so-called backward integration programs of government that allow investors to enjoy duty waivers while investing such earnings into domestic production arrangements like cement, rice, sugar. All these have ended up creating rents. And these rents, I believe, are part of the anti-export bias measures that you have in place. In addition to that, you also see a situation whereby most of the domestic producers seek measures or increase tariffs on imported competing products, while at the same time seeking a reduction in tariffs on their imported inputs. And this has to do with the structure of the industry in Nigeria. We followed the path of the Latin American countries by adopting the import substitution approach, which depended largely on imported inputs. And to date, most of the industries would want to get lower tariffs on their imported inputs and higher tariffs on imported competing finished goods. So at the end of the day, it's very difficult to determine what the effective rate of protection is. And in that regard, you begin to see a challenge in foreign exchange earnings, which is largely now comes only from oil. And what the central bank does most of the times is rationing. So you find a situation whereby the central bank would determine which commodities can get forex who can sell Forex, who can access Forex for whatever services. And that creates a lot of Forex misalignment. This is outside the previous regime of fixed exchange rate that we had for a very long time in the early to late 1990s. I believe also that the ways and means by government has had significant trade distorting effects, largely because although we adopted the presidential system of the U.S., we didn't adopt the culture where apart from the state, apart from the federal government, all the states and municipal governments are required to balance their budget. So in Nigeria, budget deficits are very common at the local government level, at the state level, and at the federal level, in which case you can not easily anticipate this implication of these expenditures on domestic demand and the allocation of resources. So in a nutshell, I believe whatever you see happening in Nigeria should be appreciated in the light of this economic background, global trends, and the need of and the desire for the country to diversify and expand production, which the current administration took the bull by the horns by removing oil subsidies and deregulating the foreign exchange market. And I believe the challenge now is getting in place the adjustment measures that can help create stability and then maybe build over from there. I think I will stop here and take any other questions that may arise. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very, very much. I suddenly have a wave of nostalgia. You mentioned the 1986 program as part of the background. I was at the IMF at the time, and I was part of the IMF team led by Paul Acquah that negotiated that program. Paul went on to become director of the governor of Ghana, governor of the Bank of Ghana. Thank you for your talk, and thank you for coming back to that. Trudi, I'm going to give it over to you. My screen shows you your name 9 times. You completely dominate my screen. The floor is yours.
Clem, thanks so much. I have to confess, I shared very briefly before we started the link that I had with some of our alumni across the continent. And so I think they have joined us, and I'm very pleased. I'm hoping that they will put their names to the registration.
Well, welcome to you all.
Thank you so much, Clem and colleagues, for organizing this very important discussion, and also to Simon and Fred. I don't have a great deal to add, but I would like to share with you a few perspectives from an African side, if you will. First of all, the trade policy development process to which both Simon and Fred have alluded, I think is a particularly important one in such a large country with such a diverse body of stakeholders across public, private, and non-profit sectors. And therefore, trade policy processes and the development of a trade policy is, of course, a very complex matter. I think there have been some recent developments which are quite important in this regard. And as Fred has shared with us, in January 2023, a new trade policy was launched. I want to go back a little bit further just to shed some light on some AFCFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area related developments, which perhaps link to these new developments in the trade policy making process. Just to confirm, I think as Fred has indicated, Nigeria has a strong commitment to multilateralism and to regional integration on the African continent. Indeed, two very important instruments, the Lagos Plan of Action and the Abuja Treaty, testify to that commitment. Nigeria has also played a leading role in shaping the African Continental Free Trade Area, and I'll say a little bit more about that. Strong trade industrial policy linkages underpin the trade policy approach and also the use of specific instruments, and including the unilateral measures to which Simon and Fred have referred. Issues such as food security, absolutely critical in this vast country. And we see, therefore, a number of measures on the continent vis-à-vis trading partners, both within the economic community of West African states, but further afield on the continent, playing quite an important role. So unilateral measures, including border closures, are not uncommon. And a country such as Benin has, in recent years, certainly felt the impact of those. These are prompted. We hear from concerns about smuggling or transshipment, and food products, some of the important staples, are often at the core of these measures. There are also, and this we hear from the private sector, concerns about domestic regulatory issues. And these apply both to trade in goods, but also trade in services and goods and services in the domestic markets. For example, product registration requirements. So this is the Nigerian Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control, plays a very important role. Cost of product registration, for example, is sometimes held to be prohibitive by some of the exporters to Nigeria. Services regulatory issues are often in the news headlines, particularly communication services. And some of the communication services providers that have established commercial presence in recent years have fallen foul of regulatory changes and have sought redress in the local courts, for example, and South Africa's MTN is certainly one of those. Some of the issues relate to SIM card registration regulations and so on, and these are definitely in the news again. So we start to see, particularly in the context of the services sectors, very important linkages between trade and investment domestic regulations. I think both have referred to the Forex issues. And I think this is particularly important. The regime developments are very important. Availability of Forex continues to be a concern. On the AFCFTA, of course, front, there is the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. And this is a continent-wide payment and settlement system in domestic currency. Now, the Nigerian Central Bank is participating, and a number of commercial banks are already engaged in the system. It's not fully functional yet, but this, in terms of facilitating cross-border trade on the continent and to have payment and settlement in domestic currency, is perhaps a development to watch. Oil matters, certainly I think Fred has very eloquently reminded us of the implications of this enormous dependence on this single commodity. It finds expression also in Nigeria's intra-Africa trade, notably with countries like South Africa, which have until recently had much more refinery capacity than most others on the continent. So exports of crude oil to South Africa, and then the import of refined product by Nigeria has been an important feature of the trade profile between these two countries. I want to say just a very little bit about the trade policy development process and link to some of the developments in the AFCFTA. Many in Geneva and further afield would remember with a lot of, I would say, admiration and thanks, the contribution of the late Honorable Chido Sakwe, both in Geneva but also in the continent. Now, Ambassador Sakwe played a leading role, excuse me, in shaping the African Continental Free Trade Area in its early stages. In fact, he chaired the Trade Negotiating Forum, the plenary body for the negotiating process under the auspices of the African Union Commission. Negotiations, as we all know, had proceeded at quite a pace. And then, before we had concluded the negotiations, however, a political decision was made to start the signature and ratification process at an extraordinary summit held in Kigali, Rwanda on the 21st of March 2018. We all expected Nigeria to be present and the president to sign the agreement. That did not happen. And the reason we understand was that some constituencies within the private sector approached the president to say this African Continental Free Trade Area could have significant impact on our domestic productive structures, domestic markets, on the Nigerian economy. And we do not support that you go to Kigali and sign that agreement. He indeed did not travel to Kigali. And if we take a look at the ratification record, we see that Nigeria signed on the 7th of July 2019 and deposited its instrument of ratification in December 2020. What this process led to was a very extensive consultation across the entire country. And this has fed into the development of the trade policy we've been making reference to. And I think this engagement with stakeholders across the country was particularly important at a very critical time, not only in the negotiation of the AFCFTA, but for trade policy, Nigeria's trade policy more generally. So quite an interesting development, a very important one. Nigeria, of course, belongs to the community of West African states. So it is the hegemon anchoring that regional economic community. ECOWAS is, or purports to be, some analysts would say, a customs union. We do have a common external tariff and the ECOWAS trade liberalization scheme. It's a managed customs union trading regime, if you like. But ECOWAS does negotiate with external trade partners collectively. And so ECOWAS has made an offer, a provisional offer of tariff concessions under the African Continental Free Trade Area. And a little bit of detail here. The offer at this point is a provisional offer for 90% of tariff lines. This is what we refer to as the Category A products. So we will liberalize those over a period of 5 years if the state parties are non-LDCs, and 10 years if the state party is a least developed country. The challenge within the customs unions, and this applies to ECOWAS, applies to SACU and the EAC, is that all of them include at least one least developed country. And the agreement now is that the customs unions will follow the LDC timeframe for liberalization. This is quite important for those wanting access to the large markets, Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, for example, to know that it'll be the LDC timeframe that is followed. Trade and services, provisional schedules of specific commitments are underway. They are reviewed by the AFCFTA Secretariat. They remain provisional because negotiations, bilateral negotiations, have not actually taken place yet. There's also, as far as trade and services is concerned, very important work on regulatory frameworks for regulatory cooperation, and the draft frameworks for financial and communication services are now complete. Nigeria again plays a very important role in these processes. Just a little bit about the intra-African trade picture for Nigeria, and what we have here, perhaps just a summary. We will release a detailed study to which Clem has referred, and it simply indicates, and we're looking here from 2014 to last year, that Nigeria, when it comes to trade and goods, enjoys a trade surplus with the rest of Africa. Of course, oil is material in this regard, but we do see that trade has in fact decreased quite considerably from the peak in 2019. We see some recovery, but certainly quite interesting to take a look at where we stand now. Mineral fuels, as I've indicated, dominate both imports and exports. For the rest, if one takes a look at the export profile, fertilizer is notable as an important export. And this very important, of course, if we take into account Russia-Ukraine war. And many of our countries on the continent used to import fertilizers from those countries. Now, Morocco, Nigeria certainly hold a lot of potential for providing fertilizer for a number of countries, and South Africa certainly is sourcing both from Nigeria and from Morocco. But for the rest, it is a very long list of small contributors to the overall exports that Nigeria makes. Destination markets, heavy concentration in ECOWAS, with the exception of South Africa, and that's crude oil. Imports, plastics, very important, but again, for the rest, a very large range of small contributors. Food products feature quite prominently. Wine from South Africa is certainly on the list as well. As far as the AFCFTA is concerned, we are still negotiating, as you will recall from my mention of provisional schedules of tariff concessions and the provisional offers of sector commitments for trade and services. But in October 2022, the AFCFTA Secretariat launched the Guided Trade Initiative. Now, this is a pilot project. It has a legal basis in a ministerial regulation. So this is not trade under the full AFCFTA. That's quite important. But it is trade under the provisional schedules of tariff concessions for those products for which the rules of origin have been agreed. Expectations about Nigeria joining the GTI have run quite strongly for a number of years, and in July this year, Nigeria started trading under the Guided Trade Initiative, exporting consignments of goods, including handbags, food products, and so on, to a number of countries: Kenya, Uganda, Cameroon, and Egypt. Number of countries are also really keen to get access to the Nigerian market under this pilot program. It was started to test the operational instruments of the AFCFTA and also to demonstrate how trade would work. And here we have the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment at the launch of the first consignments. I want to note briefly some developments related to digital trade, and I think these are particularly important in Nigeria. There's a strong commitment, development of a digital trade strategy, a digital economy development strategy, policy on 5G, and so on. So I think there are a number of interesting and important developments here. And of course, Nigeria has significant potential in a number of digital trade sectors. So digitally delivered services, certainly not only in creative sectors, but many, many others. They have also made smart partnerships with global tech companies like Ericsson to establish innovation hubs and so on. So I think there's some really, really interesting developments that we need to be monitoring here. I think there is a lot of potential. Digital inclusion is also high on the agenda with a national broadband plan, strategy, and so on, with a focus on women, youth, and small businesses. The aims are quite practical to improve internet speeds and so on, but there are still challenges related to infrastructure in certain parts of the economy. We've got to remember this is a vast country. So to conclude, I think Nigeria continues to play a very important role on the African continent, both as a trading nation. It is also a very attractive investment destination, and we've started to see that Nigeria is playing a very important role in the AFCFTA as a framework for industrialization. A number of industrialization strategy development processes are underway, with value chain projects for the automotive sector, clothing and textiles, pharmaceuticals, transport and logistics, and so on. And Nigeria is certainly participating very actively in those and has already attracted investment, for example, to the auto sector. So I think this is a space to watch also in terms of trade industrial policy linkages, but in particular in terms of the trade policy strategy going forward. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much indeed, Trudi. We have with us, I believe, yes, he's still there. We have with us Willie, who is a new member of FMG and a former director of the Trade Policy Review Division. And as such, he will have been part of the last Trade Policy Review of Nigeria. Willie, I wonder if you have perhaps a comment or two to make in that particular context. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I noticed that you're there. And now I see you. Hi.
Thank you very much, Clemens. Thanks for your welcoming words to the FMG. I am connecting from Bolivia at the moment because, as you all know, I have retired from the WTO, so I have a bit more freedom to speak. I have a couple of comments and questions concerning the three presentations, which were very interesting and excellent, I must say. First, on Simon, I think the questions that he's suggesting for the TPR itself are very good, excellent questions that I hope will help members complement with the actual reports that were prepared by the Secretariat and the Nigerian government. What I would add two or three to those questions. First of all, if I'm not mistaken, Simon referred to macroeconomic developments indicating that the services sector is not growing fast enough compared to the other traditional sectors. So one question would be, why is that so? Are there any specific bottlenecks? And Trudi referred to one or two of them, like infrastructure. And I think it's important because the services sector is the most dynamic sector in trade developments these days, and it will remain or become even more important in terms of growth, in particular digital trade and so on. So it would be good to know if there's any specific, if there are any specific bottlenecks to further development of services trade in Nigeria. The second question I would add to Simon's is Some comments about the impact of subsidies. He referred that Nigeria provides a lot of subsidies to certain sectors or firms. It would be good to know what benefits those subsidies have produced, because they are not new. They date back to a few years ago. And as you said, I observed at the last DPR the existence of those subsidies. How are those subsidies contributing to further develop these sectors, and how much they are costing? On Fred, excellent, and very nice to see you back, Fred. Good memories when we were together at the WTO Secretariat. One question is, you indicated that tariff restrictions increase at times of falling oil revenues. That indicates that the government relies a lot on when oil prices are low, on tariff revenues. And the question would be, have there been any concrete attempts to find other sources of government revenue instead of tariffs? I know that it's not easy to do so, but just curious to know if there any explorations on other sort of taxes that could generate government revenue. And my last comment is on Trudi's reference to the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a big initiative. And I saw the map includes almost all nations in the African continent. Two questions there. I don't know if there have been any analysis of the real impact of this agreement on Nigeria's economy. It would be good to know. Trudi referred to some doubts by the private sector at the beginning, and it would be good to know if those doubts have been eliminated or do they persist. And the final point is regarding the notification of this agreement to the WTO. As far as I know, until 2 months ago when I was still there, this agreement has not been notified to the WTO yet, despite the fact of it's been in place for a number of years already. And this is important because that increases the transparency of the agreement itself, and it provides an opportunity to other trading partners to learn how the agreement is functioning. So these are my three observations, and happy to see you all there. Thanks, Clem.
And thank you very much, Willie. I'd like to pick up as well on, before I pass the floor on, to pick up on one or two of those points. You made the point about notifications, and I agree with you entirely. I think it's important that the members get the opportunity to look at this agreement. If it were to be notified, it could rapidly go to the RTA review system. And that would be valuable, I think, to bring the whole process into sharper focus in the WTO. But there is the wider point about notifications. And I worry about the SPS notifications, Fred, that the last TPR worried about. And I wondered if there has been an improvement in that. You are worried about food security. SPS plays a very important role in food security, and the SPS committee, looking at the notifications, can actually give guidance, give advice on how best to use these measures to improve food security. The other point that Willie raised, and also indirectly that Trudi raised, the private sector involvement in all of this. Is the private sector now more fully on board than it was apparently initially? And in trying to bring the private sector on board, is it important perhaps to give them some more security with respect to the trade regime by increasing the number of bindings that you have? And that feeds into Willie's point again of alternative measures for revenue. Before I pass this on, are there other questions? Leilani, I'm not quite sure how these webinars work. I don't see any questions at all, nor do I see any request for the floor, but perhaps that goes through you. Jonathan, Henry, anybody wishes the floor? Alan? I don't even know if you can hear me, by the way.
We can hear you.
Good. The floor is open to anyone who wishes to come in on this. Please do. I think there are some interesting points, and in particular, the stability of the trade regime. Alan? Well, we don't seem to have, hello. We don't have any takers on any of this. Fred, may I go back to you then on the stability of the trade regime and on how that might promote diversification that you so desperately need? I don't know if I'm talking into a void here at the present moment. Leilani, is this can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Fred, may
Okay,
I give it to
Clem,
you? Yeah,
Clem, I can hear you. Clem, I think maybe I'll start with Willie's question, which
please
is
do.
a misunderstanding of the point that I made. The country is dependent on oil revenues. So when there is a boom in global oil prices, the tendency is to relax the trade regime. So you are not trying to look for other sources of income or revenue. It's largely like what you say. Well, how will I put it? You are no longer under stress in funding imports. So the regime is relaxed. But once there is a bust, what happens? There are restrictions begin to arise as to which commodities can get foreign exchange, for what purposes, even services, educational, school fees, and things like that. Even travel by civil servants becomes restricted. So that's the point I was trying to touch on. Rather than the government trying to impose restrictions or tariffs for revenue. What has happened in recent times is trying to improve the revenue base from taxes and maybe collections by customs. So if you look at the recent developments, there seem to have been some little change in more tax being paid, because a lot of the tax regime has been strengthened, requirements have improved, and so collections have also improved. Otherwise, in the past, revenue from tariff import tariffs were usually higher than even what we were getting from the domestic taxes. In terms of notifications of the AFCFTA, I think for anybody following the process, the AFCFTA at the moment remains a work in progress. Although we had finished with some of the phase one protocols, goods and services, not all the schedules or specific commitments for trading services or the schedules of preferential tariff, i.e., they are still ongoing. We are still yet to finish the rules of origin negotiations. even when you go to the phase 2 protocols, digital trade, intellectual property, investment, competition, a lot of the annexes are still being negotiated. So I agree the agreement will be notified, but I think the time is not yet right. It will be when you have a complete document with all commitments from all members across the different areas of the regime. On Nigeria's SPS notifications,
Yeah.
I don't want to be seen as being too defensive of my country, but we must accept the weaknesses in the understanding of how some of these tools and agreements can be used to reinforce domestic policy objectives.
Yeah.
I remember one of the few notifications on SPS that you will see in the WTO database was the cow foot and mouth disease. I think I had just resumed as an ambassador in Geneva, and when this came up, we made a notification, and a lot of the challenges that have arisen have not been really addressed. The quarantine service in Nigeria is quite new because in the past they were not very effective. The SPS regime is also not very efficient, which accounts for a lot of the rejection of agricultural exports from Nigeria, maybe in the EU and sometimes in the US. We've just developed a mutual recognition template, which we are hoping will take up with the relevant Nigerian counterparts in these areas. The WTO has just launched a new technical assistance program for SPS capacity building. So going forward, I believe some of these issues can be reasonably addressed. On tariff bindings, if you go through Nigeria's GATT history, you observe that prior to the Uruguay round, we had only one item under our tariff bindings, that is a stockfish, with which Norway had the initial negotiating rights. In the Uruguay round, there wasn't too much ambition in terms of liberalization. So a lot of what you had was an exercise that did not touch a lot of the actual applied rates on many of the items. But there was also the tendency to create a safeguard with other taxes. So if you take agriculture, the bindings were high, other taxes and charges came to about 150%. So you end up with a lot of water in the regime. And today, with the adoption of the common external tariff, you will see that we only have 5 bands, and the highest is around about 35%. So what would the country do? Is it unilateral liberalization, or do you wait and see if the NAMA negotiations in the WTO with Nigeria as a paragraph 6 country will allow you to do some of these things with some recognition also as a developing country that belongs to a regional economic community with a large number of LDCs. These are options that one cannot say for now. In terms of the trade policy process, I think a lot of challenges had arisen. And I think this was part of the problems that we saw with the countries signing and ratifying the AFCFTA. We had an institutional arrangement called the Enlarged National Focal Point, which comprises all trade-related ministries and agencies, along with the private sector, civil society, and the academia, particularly think tanks that have trade research capacity. Somehow, throughout the AFCFTA process at the national level, I think this mechanism was not properly utilized. So a lot of people felt they didn't quite know what they were getting into. This is notwithstanding the fact that there's a general agreement phobia in Nigeria, whether you are talking of EPA with the European Union or any other country. There are still those nationalistic feelings of you are going to lose, instead of seeing trade as a win-win. Most of them think, well, oh, if they benefit, then it means we are losing. So maybe Nigerians are not alone in that kind of thinking. But all these elements put together to create resistance. But I can give you an example, what we are doing now with the UAE. We are developing the agreement, we have thematic working groups, and the inputs and solutions and developments are coming from the relevant stakeholders in the different sectors. So one would believe that once we get to the end of that process, there will be ownership, which is a new approach. So if you look at the request lists, the tariff lines we are supplied by businessmen, if we look at our offer, a lot of the tariff lines we are influenced by inputs from the private sector. So it's how you bring people together to handle the process, which should lead to a more ownership of the outcome. I think I've addressed some of the questions that relate to me.
You have indeed. You've done a wonderful job. I'm so glad you're with us. Trudi, do you have comments perhaps to make on that and the last point, particularly the institutional aspects and bringing everybody in to the process?
Thanks very much, Clem. I absolutely support Fred, and I think we have seen quite notable changes in the processes and institutional arrangements, and of course the role of the Nigerian Office of Trade Negotiations, the NOTN, extremely important. And there have been a lot of initiatives to build the capacity of the negotiators as well. So I think this is quite important. Perhaps just a couple of issues. I think if one keeps in mind that ECOWAS is facing some significant challenges with 3 of its members earlier in the year having indicated that they will leave this regional economic community. Nigeria, I think, plays a very important role in the regional economic community, institutions, arrangements, and so on. So there are challenges there in terms of developing an ECOWAS trade policy strategy to engage with external partners. But I think what is happening with the UAE is a very important demonstration of the important strides that we've come through in the last 7-8 years. I think that's really important. I think just as far as the AFCFTA is concerned, the Secretariat is very much modeled on the WTO Secretariat. And certain provisions, of course, in the Marrakesh Agreement have been lifted and have found their way into the legal instruments of the AFCFTA. So notifications feature very prominently here as well. And one of the requirements to participate in the Guided Trade Initiative is that non-tariff measures, SPS, TBT, and so on, be notified to the Secretariat. And the Secretariat is supposed to publish those. So that transparency requirement certainly is there. It hasn't really been fully implemented yet. But a country like Nigeria, we certainly understand, is making progress as far as that is concerned. But Fred is absolutely right. The negotiations of the AFCFTA are still very, very much incomplete. So we're sitting with an agreement that entered into force at the end of May 2019. And in fact, this year is designated for the first 5-year review, which has just begun. But we have no trade under the AFCFTA yet, and key components of the FTA, tariffs and rules of origin, minimum requirements, are not yet complete. For trade and services, we don't have a great deal of progress yet. A lot of preparatory work, very important given the challenges of integrating the unequal partners of the African Union, but a great deal still has to be done. I think what will be interesting when it comes to the tariff negotiations, and this will be important for Nigeria and for the other ECOWAS member states, is what happens to the final 10% of tariff lines. 3% of lines may be excluded, and this is going to be extremely important. If one takes a look at overall intra-Africa trade, then it tends to be highly concentrated in a small number of tariff lines. So it's possible to exclude a relatively small number of tariff lines and have quite a magnified impact on, for example, continental value chain development. And I think these are kind of issues which are very, very much on the agenda at the moment, and certainly for a country like Nigeria, given its industrialization ambition and diversification ambition. So I think I'll stop there. On the phase 2 protocols, I think this is quite important. And again, Nigeria has done a lot of groundwork on digital trade, but a lot of work on trade and services, domestic regulation, and regulatory reform, institutional development, and so on, is still underway. We have just heard that the annexes to the protocol on digital trade have now been finalized. So they will be adopted by the AU Assembly in February next year. The protocol on investment is now complete. The annex on dispute settlement has just been finalized as well. But work on the 7-8 annexes for the protocol on intellectual property rights is still underway. And this could be a really important one for Nigeria as well, to promote research, development, innovation, innovation systems, and so on, attracting foreign direct investment. So I think there's certainly potential there. Thanks very much.
And thank you, Trudi. We're about to run out of time, but before I pass the floor back to Mario to close us, Simon, do you perhaps have a few words that you'd like to add?
Yes, I do. I found the discussion very interesting, and it makes me wonder if there's quite a lot of commonalities between countries which are struggling to diversify their economies away from oil and petrochemicals, that rather than thinking about this as a pre-TPR session, maybe we should have a session with a group of countries which would like to share their experiences in this regard. I mean, you could take some countries from different parts of the world who I think have tried to do interesting things in this regard, and one could talk about the role that the trade and investment regime can play in supporting the diversification process. Just a thought.
No, it's a very good thought, and I had to say I'd thought of it is wrong, but it is not something that falls on deaf ears. Fred, Trudi, Simon, I want to thank you all very, very much for what you've done. I've learned a lot from this. I hope that you've all felt the same way. Mario, I'm going to hand it back to you. We are out of time for you to close the meeting. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Clem. Thank you, Clem. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Fred and Trudi. It has been a very interesting meeting. Actually, good questions, good answer, and a lot for reflection precisely in the next TPR. We are already late. So on behalf of the GMI, Friends of the Multilateral System Group, I thank you for this participation, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.